I want to start this discussion first with saying that I am not at all married to the proposal. That is the important part. So the proposal was made 2 years ago when the current state was a bit different. I had an idea in my head on how to start changing the status quo. And 2 years in, we are in a different situation, right?
Right.
Cool. All right, now explain.
Yeah, so I think my issue initially was, okay, how does this reordering sort of fit in with the other release tools work we want to do? And then you mentioned, like, hey, we can update it, etc. And I've been staring at it for a while, trying to figure out, okay, how do I update it sort of without rewriting the whole thing? Because I looked at the proposal and kind of realized, okay, if we, for example, flip it so that we run the deployer first and then release tools, that doesn't actually make a difference because the deployer still has to wait for release tools. So it's basically the same as release tools triggering the deployer. It's just we have a pipeline, I guess, waiting instead of a pipeline being created when it can do something. And I noticed that there's a bunch of things sort of discussed between the lines that I think are separate challenges. So for example, being able to build just Gitly or just Gitly and Workhorse. And in other words, I guess incremental releases.
Yeah.
And yeah, the other thing, like, being able to query sort of what is deployed, what will be deployed, etc. And so with all that in mind, I was kind of looking at Epic. It's like, okay, how can I update this without basically creating a different Epic? That's
that the answer to that type of question usually can be, I can just close the Epic because we decided to go a different route. But I understand why you're approaching this a bit differently. So let me give you first an idea of how this started and what was the original idea. And then you can make conclusions yourself. So first of all, this was an issue. This was a discussion issue where an idea was thrown. So it got promoted to an Epic because we thought, we'll maybe do some work on it. That's one thing. The second thing is, this was supposed to be a transition towards a situation where we want to be on Kubernetes. And the situation is, instead of building this big monolithic whatever that will build everything every time, what if we have a situation where now that in Kubernetes everything runs on its own isolated, right? Like you have different images and so on. What if you trigger a deployment by pushing a tag in a canonical project, which would mean it is more decentralized when it comes to actually rolling out the changes. And it would not be strictly related to releasing. Release would be an artifact of the end of the pipeline versus the start point, which is what's the case now. So currently the starting point is, I'm going to create a release and I'm going to deploy that to environments or release it to public. But if you consider how many changes we actually have and where the changes are situated, you are just spinning wheels in the spots, right? And the idea would have been, for example, a Workhorse maintainer released a change. They are the ones responsible for compatibility between all the different moving pieces. They would be the ones pushing a tag, which would be then building whatever is necessary to be built only for Workhorse, and then some other pipeline somewhere would be able to pick up that change and roll it out. So just based on this explanation, you already see that this is like a huge idea that is like, you can't really even iterate towards it because it's kind of disconnected from where we are at the moment.
Yeah, and that's kind of the problem I ran into is I realized, okay, and there's basically multiple epics sort of discussed here implicitly. I don't know exactly. I think it's because I'm too attached to this existing description. I was basically drawing a blank. Where it's like, okay, wait, how am I going to split this up?
You were just reading what was written, right? Like you don't have the background.
I don't know, for some reason. Well, so I had the background in the history and I read it, but for some reason it was just like I knew, okay, so we want to, for example, deploy individual components. And that's going to require some changes to release tools, etc. But then I was like, okay, but how does that sort of fit in this proposal, in these graphs that are made, like where you sort of flip things around, and how am I going to update the epic without completely rewriting? But so what I think we need to do is close this epic, maybe not necessarily now, but within the next few days. And I need to take a look at, okay, what is basically necessary if we want to say deploy just Giddily or deploy just Sidekick to this one Kubernetes pod, I think the term is. And sort of how does that apply to release tools?
Exactly.
And I think what I've also been maybe a bit confused with is because this current epic talks about building the different components, and when you push, and there's a bit about that no CEE commit is responsible for triggering a deploy, etc. Somehow I think that sort of pushed me towards this idea of, oh, that means that repositories themselves need to be in charge of building whatever they need to build to be released, and oh, that then creates issues, blah blah blah. Like for example, if you do it that way, like every repository itself builds itself, pushes itself into package cloud, whatever, we're gonna end up with like Giddily doing it one way and the GitLab shell doing it a different way, even though effectively the build process is probably the same for all of them.
Yep.
But
that is something to consider, right? Like you have a couple of options here. So one option is continue down this path where release tools is the coordinator. Like it is the starting and the end point of everything. That is okay, but that means that we will be always responsible for anything related to deployments and releases, right?
Yeah, so the sort of, how would you call it? The catch there, I guess, is I think we always will be anyway. So even if we say, okay, hey, Giddily, it's your responsibility to build a proper package, etc. If that breaks a release for whatever reason, people are going to come to us anyway.
Yep.
At least initially.
This is the second part. Like there is a second approach, which is release tools is the central location. But instead of starting everything, it collects everything and then pushes, right? Like I see it. If I could now quickly draw, that would be great. Actually, I can quickly draw. Give me 1 sec. I have a tool for this, and I'm just going to show you.
Yeah, I would fire up just like Photoshop and put my tablet in, basically. But
yeah, I'm doing that. So
more USB cables.
All right. So this is what you're seeing. It's a paper.
Yeah. Right.
All right. Like the second approach is, the thing that I'm telling you is you have a central location which is release tools, but order matters.
Right.
Okay, this is very quick and ugly drawing, right? Oops.
Flips the angle.
Click the button. All right. So you see, you have like many things doing things independently, release tools collecting them and then spreading them out. Meaning this is the entry, which is GitLab, Rails, Shell, and so on. Release tools gathers them and then operates. Basically, this is like just similar to what Kubernetes does, basically, right?
Yeah.
That's one approach. And the other approach is release tools is at the start. Like it starts and finishes everything, which is something that we need to consider. And Yorick, that's why I encourage you to look at this epic, because if we are going to go down the route of doing work with release tools, we need to make a decision now before we actually go down the route of starting to rewrite. So one of the approaches you can take here as well is consider investigating what other people are doing with it, right? Not many companies have the hybrid approach we have right now, because many are just still migrating. But if nothing else, there are companies that are building and shipping software. They must be doing some of these things somehow.
Yes, as far as I know, the approach is usually that, well, you have two stages. You have like the small startup where you push from your Git repository and the project itself deploys itself. That's what we did at my previous employer. It was all scoped per project. And they worked because they were independent. And then I think you have the things like Facebook or GitHub or whatever, where they push the master and it triggers a build in some separate project that collects whatever it needs and then does its thing. There's something to be said for both. I think if projects themselves are responsible for tagging and then sort of triggering release tools pipeline from that tag or SHA or whatever it is, I think that is not necessarily any better than those projects triggering a pipeline and saying, I think of it. So put it this way: if we, for example, only look at the master branch and we want to deploy per commit, that is, well, there's nothing to tag, so the project would just send the SHA to release tools to say, hey, release Giddly 1234 ABC. The tricky thing with tagged releases is that theoretically it is nice if a project creates the tag itself, then sends the Giddly, release tools, the tag name, and say, hey, build a release from this tag. And release tools takes that, etc. The issue then is if we want to do, say, a monthly release, we still need a piece of software that creates all those tags and creates one release tools pipeline and say, hey, here are all the tags. Do you think? And so where we end up in that service, basically release tools and I guess build tools, whatever you'd like to call it. And build tools is only used for these, stable releases. Oh, my brake software is yelling. Hold on one sec. How do I disable save? Yeah, whatever. Here we go. 30 minutes. And so there's also the issue that for some reason, I think if we give these repositories too much control over the build process, it's going to be inconsistent. And at the end of the day, it's still our responsibility, but then we are responsible for something a different project is doing. So I guess being a bit more cautious, I guess I would prefer to keep that in release tools so we can say, okay, not only are we responsible, we actually know how it works. And so I think therefore, part of the problem is we have this weird setup now where we're doing like auto deploys, but they're not actually from master commits, like a separate branch. And then we have Giddly where we sometimes do auto deploys, I think, for like tags and SHAs. And I think the end setup, at least based on what I currently know, is that release tools does all the tagging, everything, and these different components, they can just start a pipeline saying, oh, hey, here's the comma separated list of projects and their versions you want to build. That's it. And the release tools figures out, oh, we are building version 13.0. That means for all the projects, we use this tag format.
Yep. That is a valid approach.
Right. And I think perhaps a slightly counterintuitive thing there is that most developers, I would imagine, are used to this workflow where they push a tag and that triggers a build, deploy, etc. Whereas now it's more like you send a message, that creates a tag, and then it starts building. Which it's effectively the same thing. It's just like different direction first, I guess. Benefit there mostly that we don't really have to change anything for all these repository workflows and whatever. We just tell people, like, if you want to release Giddly, start a pipeline here with this field and value, and off you go. And that is eventually something you can actually hook into push. Where if you push the master, you just start a release tools pipeline with Giddly as the project and whatever the SHA is as the thing to build. And then it knows, oh, we don't have to tag, so.
There is something to be said about moving this more into a merge request workflow, even if it means automated, right? Like Like you're just saying now, you could theoretically say to all of the engineering, like this is the place you're going to create merge requests for your version bumps. You're responsible for making sure that you provide the SHA and the version. And like that could be like a small iteration, and you can centralize it and say, all right, based on this matrix or this JSON we have under this version that we want to ship this month, at any point in time, release tools or us as release managers can take the latest weird tag that we have and make it official.
Right. Yeah, so I think the
right, that can also solve another problem for you, which is you're seeing auto-deploy and self-manage as a completely separate things. But in essence, auto-deploy got built on top of all of the self-managed releases tools that we have. The only difference is we automated that creation of the tags, and we have a special format for a specific reason, right? Because somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think if we start with the approach where release tools is still responsible for tagging everything, changing that to an approach where the repositories tag first and then trigger release tools is not that big of a change. In fact, I think that you could do incrementally, where you could say, oh, for this project, using a feature flag or whatever, we don't tag, we expect it's already tagged. Because I think if you start with the other approach of repositories initiate, I think that's too big of a change, at least in one go, and also workflow-wise, because it means we have to standardize what tag formats we use, who's responsible for tagging, what to do if it doesn't work, yada, yada, yada. And I think at the end of the day, that process is probably going to be the same for every repository. They're still going to push a tag in the same format. They're going to have, one or more version files. And I don't think we have cases where, well, we have Omnibus for just building Omnibus and, compiling whatever it needs. For Kubernetes, I'm not sure. Like if we want to deploy, for example, Gitly on Kubernetes, do we compile it through Omnibus or do we do something separately, for example?
It's a completely separate process. It goes through the CNG repository, and that is built similar way that we do Omnibus, mostly because that was the shortest amount of time we could spend to build this whole pipeline. So,
but so we still have this sort of single project in charge for compiling whatever.
Exactly. So it's like, let me link you real quick to one of the pipelines. Actually, I can screen share and then link you. Just to see how it actually works, but just be very aware that no one is married to this approach, because all of these approaches were the quickest way to get us to point B, right? All right, so if you take a look at this pipeline here, CNG, you have a lot of preparation, right? Like these are the base containers. And then based on this base, we build on top of it. And then, like all of these congregate into one base container, and then it continues further, where we now start using the base container in all of these in parallel. And like you can see, for example, here, once we've built GitLab Rails EE, we build on top of this one all the dependent services.
Right. Yeah, so my thought process there is basically merely pushing the, why's my webcam changing dark all the time? If we merely push tags to projects as being their responsibility, I don't think they will gain us anything, because the tagging part is not the interesting part, basically. I think long term it will be interesting if, for example, when we want to release Gitly, it's the Gitly repository that actually compiles it and spits out a Docker image, a Debian package, whatever you want. And then if we want to do a final release, we take one of those artifacts, whatever it is, and sort of just squash it into an Omnibus package or a CNG or whatever it is. The main benefit there would be like, oh, the Gitly people are in charge of how they are going to compile things, because they theoretically know that best.
Should be knowing, exactly.
Instead of, the build team having to know how to compile and build and whatever these 20 different things. I think you could still do that where you have like sort of a central repository that defines certain configurations you might need to follow, or maybe not. But I think that is something we can do, can and probably should do separately, because that's a big change. So I think sort of short term, as in the next year or two, I would say release tools are still being the sort of entry point, still tagging things, still triggering omnibus, CNG, etc. It just has support for doing that for certain things only.
Yeah.
Only build Giddily, only. And I guess the yeah, and so sort of quality of life in a sense that you can not just say, oh, build. You say, you know, build Giddily version this, build whatever. And then, yeah, release tools would still trigger a deploy, I suppose. Yeah, so thinking out loud here. So we'd have to have one epic, I guess, for supporting.
Before you go down
Right.
the epic route, I suggest like consume this information that you just have gotten. Go and speak with Jarv as well. Like, see what his vision is. Take a bit of time to marry whatever information you've gathered there, and organize your thoughts, and only then think about epics and all of that. Even I would even advise you maybe put all of these things, all of these thoughts in a Google Doc, just to
I was
organize
just doing it in an issue actually, because yeah, it's quite a lot to take in.
Exactly.
There's only so much my notebook can fit.
And then
I'm running out of paper anyway.
And then at some point, like, you might decide closing all of these epics anyway and saying, I'm starting from scratch. Thanks you for all this information. Take a look at what we've concluded, right? Like, don't be focusing too much on whether this epic is going to be reformulated in that. As long as you connect them later on, right? When you create a new one and you connect all of those pieces and explain why you're closing one for another, no one is, at least from my side, I don't think anyone is married to any of the epics that.
But so then for the group conversation on Friday, how does that affect this epic, or is this epic just an example? Like, you know,
don't worry about it. I'll handle that. Like, this is now just an example. What you can also do in the epic is just write up in the comments somewhere that you're investigating, or where you're investigating, or just like even 2-line sentences that this might be too complex or is not fitting into 2020 year state, and I'm looking into this separately. Basically, you are the DRI. Just make sure that you're the DRI in the epic, and how you're going to formulate the epic later on, it's fine. And then in the infra group conversation, this is only for us to showcase things. I can also just add an edit to say we are thinking about, and actually not going to do that right now anyway.
Okay, no, because I thought somehow this epic was going to be discussed in detail. I think that's also why I was a little like, how are we going to update this? It's just close.
And no, totally makes sense. And I just wanted to have something to rally around when we are talking. But the point here is you're now uncovering that there is like quite a lot more than what that epic is. So let's not organize our thoughts around epics rather than around the problem. Cool. Just make sure that you talk with Jarv and see whether he has anyone else he would like you to talk with, because Skarbek as well, by the way, because what we want to achieve is not lock ourselves into the current situation, but if we are adapting the current situation, making sure that we are open for the changes that we are going through right now with Kubernetes. Like, those are happening.
I think that's anyway, I was going to talk to Jeff anyway, so I'll see.
All right, need to drop out. Thanks.
See ya.
Thanks for the chat. Later.